ransomware has kind of proliferated since the rise of cryptocurrency. However, ransomware isn't just ransomware in the typical sense of file encryption. There are different types of campaigns and attacks that are ransom driven. We've had DDoS for ransom activities, which kind of picked up steam in 2014, 2015. Basically, it was the same intent where they're demanding money, but instead of encrypting files, they were going to disrupt the availability of your website and your resources by launching DDoS attacks. That sort of went to the wayside as ransomware itself picked up around 2018. But then last year we started seeing an uptick in those ransom for DDoS types of attacks coming back last year. And then more interestingly, towards the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, we're seeing the ransomware groups themselves start using, a three-prong approach where not only are we going to encrypt your files and leak your data if you don't pay us, but we're also going to launch DDoS attacks, which it actually defeats the purpose of trying to respond to these guys because they're purposely now disrupting your ability to respond, to either make payment or negotiate, which is actually becoming an unfortunate trend. There's actually organizations out there that they allow or they support or enable your organization to negotiate and make payment to the ransomware operators. But aside from that, ransomware attacks is not just a dude sending you a phishing email or exploiting, some weak infrastructure and installing the malware. There's an entire economy behind this whole ransomware campaign and ransomware tactic going on, and it includes the original developers and the authors of the ransomware. You have the distributors like middlemen who they know the developers and then they know the people that want to buy it, and they kind of make the transaction and they keep a fee for themselves for being the finder, like a finder's fee. And then you have the affiliate operators, which are actually individuals that carry out the attack. So the malware or the ransomware developers and authors aren't the ones really carrying out the attacks or launching the ransomware. They're actually selling it. They're selling access to their malware to other people. And in exchange, they sort of get that passive income and that residual from any successful attacks or any successful payments that those affiliate operators gain from their own attacks. And then you have access brokers, which is actually one of the biggest contributors to this whole cyber criminal economy. Access brokers are basically individuals that have already established access within target networks, whether it was through RDP, whether it was through SMB. They already have a foothold in the network, and then they sell that access off to the affiliate operators or the distributors, and then they can do whatever they want, whether they want to launch ransomware, whether they want to steal data from that. And then of course you have the admins and then the hosters of those marketplaces and forums where all this malware and all these transactions between the distributors and operators and access brokers actually take place. So there's a lot of steps and a lot of key players in this whole quote unquote economy of ransomware that we're dealing with. So it's a multi-pronged approach. Targeting just the affiliate operators and targeting just the authors isn't going to solve the problem. So there's a few ways that offensive measures have been taken, which we'll talk about later in this presentation, that can help disrupt the ongoing ransomware threat that we're seeing today. Another item that we've actually sort of assessed with moderate confidence over the last few months in our monthly intelligence reports is we might start seeing a trend of nation state or state sponsored activity leveraging ransomware, because for most of the state-sponsored activity we see, it's always just espionage. They're in there quietly, they're taking a bunch of data, they're siphoning it out. We don't really see any outright attacks because the intent of most state-sponsored groups is to remain quiet, to remain surreptitious and do what they need to collect what they need to. However, this trend we believe might be changing soon. In 2020 or in the end of 2020 last year, we did see pretty basic attempts by APT27 conducting ransomware operations against their targets. It wasn't a big name ransomware strain or anything like that we're commonly used to seeing in the news, like Ryuk or Conti or Maze. If some of you folks that follow the ransomware stuff out there, it was just a very small batch type of ransomware. But the fact that they're exploring this type of tactic is actually quite concerning, because not only do they have the high capabilities to exploit and target, organizations, using destructive or ransomware type of malware is actually going to be even more of a concern, like I said, for future campaigns and for defenders. I think the reason that's holding them back right now is it could probably use or it would result in a different sort of response from defenders and from governments if they started outright using ransomware attacks. I mean, the word cyber war has been thrown around so much that it's become stale, but using this new technique could elevate the reaction that comes from the victims or the government of where the victims are located. So I think they're treading water right now, and I think this whole proxy logon and SolarWinds events are going to be the pivotal point of how nation state activity goes in the future. Targeting of vendors and third-party suppliers, so supply chain targeting. We see a lot of ransomware operations targeting organizations that have customers or that are associated themselves with other organizations like MSSPs, where all you have to do is target the supplier, and in turn you get access to the networks of all these other customers, and you kind of hit 10 birds with one stone. The most recent example is the Acelion breach, which had a lot of high impact, a lot of organizations that were impacted, like Kroger, Qualys, Jones Day. This is concerning not only because you have the operations and the availability of these websites disrupted because of the ransomware itself, but then you're also having the data from some sensitive customers like Qualys. Qualys is a vulnerability scanning organization, and some of the data that was leaked from Qualys included vulnerability reports for their customers. So not only have you hit Qualys, but now you've released what vulnerabilities that Qualys's customers have, and that can allow other threat actors, whether they be cyber criminals or nation state actors, to target Qualys's customers. And now they actually have the intelligence report of what the vulnerabilities are, so they can now key in what vulnerabilities they need to exploit if they wanted to go after those people. So it's more than just, hey, my files are locked out. There's a lot of tertiary and secondary impact from ransomware operations now. Next slide, please.
Sure. Hey, AK, let me just ask you a quick opinion question. For this rise in state-sponsored or nation-state activity, ransomware activity, do you believe the primary objective is it to damage and disrupt an adversary, their victim, or is it a way to raise hard currency for some of the states that maybe have a difficult time raising currency?
I think it could be both, honestly. So there have been unconfirmed reports that North Korea has already been doing this for a long time using TrickBot and Ryuk. A lot of researchers are going back and forth, from what I understand, as far as is North Korea actually using ransomware for financial gain. So North Korea is one example. If they ever went after it, it would be for financial gain, because for the most part, that's what most of their operations are. It's hacking banking accounts, or like Swift and stuff like that for financial gain. APT 27s was also a financial gain, which was sort of a pivot from their typical espionage operations. But if this was ever to escalate into a situation where they have acquired all the documents they needed through their espionage, and now they just want to set the building on fire without giving a care of whether they get paid or not, it could just depend from adversary to adversary. If Russia or China or some of these more well-resourced companies really don't have a need for $1 million, and all they want to do is take the information and then like I said, set the building on fire just as a kick them while they're down thing, then that's absolutely possible.
Okay. Yeah, there are no one size fits all for sure, but the objective of the adversary, really it kind of determines the end outcome for the victim. Mm-hmm. Next slide.
So these are some trends that we've observed as far as vulnerabilities that are exploited by ransomware. This is all manually driven data that we've taken from other researchers and open source information and kind of put it into our threat intel platform. So as you can see in orange, I know it's a little blurry, but we couldn't make it any clearer. Maltego just kind of has its limitations with copy pasting type stuff. And the smaller orange circles are the ransomware strains themselves, and the red ones are the vulnerabilities that they target. And the bigger the circle, that means there are more arrows or more ransomware strains pointing to that vulnerability or exploiting that vulnerability. And you can see the three largest circles are actually vulnerabilities from, more than 5 years ago. And one of our long-standing assessments within TRT is that adversaries are going to just continue to exploit these old vulnerabilities from 2 years or older because they know it works. They don't have to develop 0 days. They don't have to create custom tools or anything. They know the old stuff works because, whether it's a patching issue or whether organizations just aren't aware or whether those vulnerabilities allow them access to more sensitive data than other vulnerabilities do. So you can see a lot of these ransomware strains, many of them didn't actually come out until the last 3 or 4 years, but they were observed exploiting vulnerabilities from almost 8 years ago. So that kind of is in, this chart basically is just to show how it's in line with our assessment that a lot of the older vulnerabilities will still continue to be exploited by not only ransomware operators, but adversaries of all types, nation state, cyber criminal. And so it's imperative to be abreast of what vulnerabilities are out there, having terrain mapping and visibility of your terrain, and then also making sure patching is available where possible, because the older stuff is probably still going to be hit before the next 0 day, with a few exceptions, of course. So continuing on to our exploitation trends, phishing, of course, is the key way, or one of the major ways, that ransomware operators and other malware campaigns continue to leverage vulnerabilities. Is just through the human. Send phishing emails. Whether it's a compromised Word document or whether it's a link that downloads the malware itself. A lot of these user-enabled attacks or user-enabled infections are still very popular with ransomware operators. We covered the long-standing vulnerabilities in popular software, and we've listed out some of the high-risk approaches or high-impact approaches that they'll continue to use, as far as which software specifically puts you at most risk, especially if it's a critical remotely compromised type of vulnerability. So obviously we have our Microsoft Office, Active Directory and other Windows services. We have Oracle WebLogic, which is adopted in many pen testing tools. The VPN providers like Palo Alto, Adobe Flash, VMware, Atlassian. We've seen all of these being leveraged in ransomware campaigns as well as non-ransomware campaigns. So we're just listing these. We're listing these products just to show that the more popular the product and the more critical the vulnerability, those are the ones that we should probably keep an eye out for. As far as protocols go, we have our SMB and RDP. SLP, UPnP is also one that's kind of gone out of fashion, but we still have new critical vulnerabilities coming out for UPnP. I still see arguments between researchers that UPnP is not an issue because X, Y, and Z. From a risk standpoint, I think it's always safe to just ensure that certain protocols or software that don't need to be facing the internet just be turned off, and if they have to, just ensure that they're secure as possible. And then as far as industries that we're observing being targeted, based off, like I said, not only observations but also just our assessment based off the impact that they'll have if they are targeted. We have healthcare, of course, because of the coronavirus and all the research that's going into there. We've seen an uptick of pretty much any type of malware campaign that's hitting healthcare. Retail, transportation, and technology, specifically managed services. The managed services kind of goes into the third-party impact that I mentioned earlier, where all you have to do is hit one organization, like in a supply chain type of compromise, and you'll compromise dozens of other organizations just through one. And then retail and transportation is one we've assessed that are high-profile industries, only because with last year's and the current ongoing situation with social and economic disruption we've had because of the coronavirus and other issues, any major disruption in transportation and retail is going to have again economic and social repercussions, because you've pretty much halted the basic needs of your society. And if you have a major or if you have a major campaign that targets a lot of the big retailers and transportation agencies, that could put a serious temporary disruption in day-to-day operations for not organizations only, but also for your everyday civilian. Next slide, please.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the trends I saw over the last couple of years is, well, not only healthcare because you're there, but the bad guys are looking for particular segments of society or organizations that have a willingness to pay and also an urgency to pay. So, when a hospital is hit with a ransomware, it's not like they're going to negotiate for a couple of weeks or go to their backups. They're going to cough up money pretty fast, no pun intended. I've also seen attacks on governments, especially schools. Again, those are institutions that have ready access to money and have shown a willingness to pay quickly. So those have become favorite targets for the bad guys.
Exactly. So the top ransomware strains exploited in the wild. I think some of this data is from a report that's a few months old because a few of these on this list are either no longer active or just have been completely dismantled. Maze Egregor is one of those that's inactive now, but it was the biggest up until about December 2020. We saw a lot of Zeppelin and Tycoon activity in 2019, 2020. Those have kind of calmed down, but the rest are still pretty up and about as far as activity and observations. And just like any malware or any cycle, whether you're talking about cybersecurity or economics or politics or whatever, there's spikes and troughs, there's ebbs and flows. The pendulum always swings to the opposite side eventually. So we've seen different cycles with ransomware as well, based off vulnerabilities that are discovered. The evolution in defenses and detections from defenders can also change ransomware tactics. If a particular strain of ransomware was developed by lesser skilled, more higher level authors, then they might not be able to adapt as quickly. So that particular strain of ransomware just won't survive in the wake of the more popular and the more robust ones. The arrest and takedown of ransomware operators that we've seen over the past few months, over the past few years, that constitutes a big disruption for ransomware activity. Retirement of ransomware developers, we've seen this happen twice with GanCrab and the Maze operators, where there was no disruption to their operations. They were chugging along, they were making a lot of money, and then pretty much they just dropped a note on the forum saying, hey, over the past year and a half, we've made $200 million. I think we're good. Thanks. And then you just don't see them again. But they usually come back in the form of another strain of ransomware. They just rebrand themselves. GanCrab is believed to have evolved into Sodinokibi, aka Revil, which is the first one you see on the list here. They share the code is very similar. There's a lot of overlaps in the code, so it's believed that Revil is just a descendant of GanCrab. The third on the list, Egregor, is a descendant of Maze ransomware. Maze operators retired a few months ago. So we see a lot of evolution. I don't think a lot of these folks entirely go away unless there's some sort of kinetic operation against their infrastructure or the personnel specifically. And then successful campaigns that just result in follow-on compromises. So a lot of times the ransomware will be dormant for a long time, but then they'll hit one really juicy jackpot, and that results in the compromise of multiple other organizations because it was either a third-party breach or a supply chain type of compromise. Conti is one of them. Conti and Klopp actually have been seeing a resurgence over the past maybe 6 to 8 months because of their specific targeting of the healthcare sector, and that's been a hot button topic and a very big target for cyber adversaries since 2020. So you see certain strains that specialize in targeting certain industries, and when that cycle or when that flavor of the month comes back, then you see a rise in these operators again. So we've seen a rise in Klopp and Conti, but we've seen a decrease in Zeppelin and Snake only because the focus, the media attention, and maybe the opportunity just has changed. So we'll probably see this happen again down the line. We'll see another strain come up, and everyone's going to be talking about that. But the most important thing is, and I think David will discuss this later in the presentation, is that most of these strains pretty much leverage and utilize the same tactics, the same endpoint or network-based behaviors. So a lot of basic approaches to detection and prevention can actually significantly reduce the threat of a majority of these ransomware strains, only because they follow a very similar pattern. There's a lot of overlaps in their tactics and techniques. So just because we see changes in the strains that are being reported, that doesn't mean that we have to completely start from scratch. A lot of your pre-existing policies or your pre-existing stances on defending and preventing will address any new strain of malware that comes out, just because they kind of use the same tactic over and over.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that these guys are bad guys. You know, they don't have these rules and laws about IP, intellectual property, or patents, or any of that. If they see something that works, they'll go steal that too. So you see a lot of overlap in technique and behaviors, and they're not like these comic book mega mind geniuses. They're simply stealing code or tactics back and forth from each other, and they'll just use whatever they can. They have very low boundaries in their behaviors. So it's not a surprise to see these identical tools, tactics, compromise techniques. Once a vulnerability is known, everybody swarms on it. So it's a highly dynamic, incestuous market for the bad guys. They're not terribly clever. Once one technique is found, everybody swarms on that when it works.